It might be the first time that I've ever met Jesus during announcements. Wow, Sarah was on fire. So, hey, I'm thrilled to be here, and I've known Pastor Chris and Monica for a while, and known of them for even longer. And I just want to say this, that Cedar Valley Church sends its greetings, and I would tell you this, that Life Center, thank you. Life Center, you guys are the church that we aspire to be, that you encourage us, that we want to have the ministry that you're having, where you're ministering in your community. What you're doing here is powerful, the ministry that you all have, and it encourages us, and we aspire to be like you. We want to be a church like Life Center, where you're reaching your community. So thank you guys for that. Have you ever noticed this? There are things in life that are very funny if it's not happening to you. You know what I'm saying? It's funny if it's not happening to you. Like, I could be up here and I could preach all morning and I'm having a good time and I appreciate everybody, and then I walk out and my wife says, "Hey, your fly's down." It's funny to you. It's not funny to me. About a year and a half ago, I was doing a wedding, and it was an older couple at our church. He's been long time married, like over 40 years. She's been long time married, over 40 years, and now they're going to marry each other. And I knew him, and I knew his wife, and I knew them very well. And right away in the ceremony, I called her by his deceased wife's name. And afterwards, everybody's like, "That was so funny. You called her the wrong name." And I'm like, "Funny to you, not funny to me." Right? Here's one that I always like. You can be here at church. You can be at the mall, you can be at the local park, and this is funny to me, and it might be funny to you if it's not you, and you see somebody there with a small child, and the small child just goes into meltdown mode, and they hit the floor. You know how kids just go limp? They just hit the floor. I don't have children. It is always funny to me. But if it's you, it's not funny, right? And the question becomes, like in these situations. So I had a good friend, for instance, and we were talking one time, and how many of you are oldest children? You're the oldest child? Okay, you're spoiled, and we all know it. And so my friend was talking to me, and he was telling me about his oldest child, and his oldest child was the first grandchild in either family. Do you know where I'm going with this? That kid got everything, and so he just said, our kid had so many ridiculous toys and whatever, that he said, my wife and I just made a pact, we're not buying our children toys. They have too many toys, we're not buying them toys. And so one day he was at Walmart, and his son comes up to him, he's about 4 years old. He says, Dad, you know how kids do this? Mom, Dad, Mom. And finally he says, yeah, buddy. He says, what do you want? He says, Dad, I want this. He's got some little Power Ranger or something. He says, Dad, I want this Power Ranger. And he says, no, buddy, remember, we have enough toys. We're not, Dad. And finally he turns around and says, what? And he says, Dad, I want this. And he says, no, buddy, remember, we talked about that. No toys. We're not buying toys. And his kid goes full on hissy fit in the middle of Walmart, drops to the floor, goes limp. And he says this, right out of it, he says, we never get anything. And my buddy was explaining it to me, and he says, you know what, when my kid goes hissy fit, I can deal with it. Like, other parents are there, they get it. When my son says, Dad, we never get anything, he says, I can live with that. But then he goes one step further and he says, you don't even care about me. And he says, you know what, as a dad, that hurts me. Because he said, nothing could be further from the truth. My son, and those of you who have children, you know this, my son will never know the extent to which I love him. My son will never know about how when he was very young, right after he was born, he'll never know how we went home and had to keep coming back to the hospital and how many nights we slept at the hospital because they didn't know if our son was going to make it. He'll never know that. He'll never understand the depths to which we love him. And so we left, we separated, and I went home, and a few days later, I was kind of laughing about that whole thing, like, Dad, we never get anything. And then I thought, how different am I? Do you know, like, I feel like I've had a pretty good life, a decent life. And yet when things are going along and all of a sudden you don't get something you want, I don't get something I want, or things aren't quite going exactly the way I'd like, then I look to heaven and I say, God, do you even care? Do you know what I'm going through? Did you forget? Did you fall asleep? Do you not understand what's happening to me? Do you not go? No. Right? What do we do in those situations? Because I don't think I'm the only one here in this room who's ever done that. Like, I think other people have done that too, where life is going along, and all of a sudden something happens, and it's not good. And you don't like it, and very oftentimes we think in our head, God, do you even know what's going on here? Have you fallen asleep? Did you forget? Are you asleep at the wheel? Do you know what I'm going through? And what do we do in those situations? What do we do when circumstances are really difficult? Like maybe you're having a physical health problem and it's just not been good and you're not getting good reports, or it's your child or it's your parent, and you pray and you say, God, do you even know what's going on? Have you forgotten me? Do you even care? And maybe there's a relationship problem, and maybe it's your marriage, maybe it's a relationship between a child and a parent, and you've prayed, and you've prayed, and you've come to this altar, and you've prayed, and nothing is changing, and you say, and you might even say it out loud, God, do you even care? Do you have any clue what's going on? Do you know what I'm going through? Do you care? And maybe you're having a financial issue, and it's just been tough. And you prayed about it. And you prayed with someone else. And you prayed silently, and you prayed out loud, and you get to the point and you say, God, do you even know what's going on here? And do you even care? And what do we do in those times? Right? That's what we'll see in the story this morning. We'll see that exact situation where there's been extreme suffering, and you'd think one would ask, God, do you care? What does she do? What do you do? What do I do when we get into those situations where things are so tough, and then we feel like, God, do you care? I'm reading from 1 Samuel, and this is 1 Samuel. I'm starting in verse 1. And it says, there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Stop. Don't get lost in the names. Don't worry about it. Because sometimes when I read the Old Testament, you see all these crazy names, and I say, I don't recognize any of those names. I don't know any of those names. Don't sweat it. And then it says this in verse 2. He had 2 wives. He had 2 wives. It says, it's 2 wives, Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah. Everybody say Hannah. Hannah had none. Hannah had no children. Then it goes on to say this, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrificed to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. Shiloh was the center of worship. It's where the temple was. And then he goes on in verse 4, and it says, whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he'd give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, everybody say Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her. And here's the key, the Lord had closed her womb. Then it goes on and it says, because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, everybody say Hannah, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah, say Hannah, went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her until she wept and would not eat. Stop. Are you kidding me? Now, let me explain a little something about the Old Testament, just how they viewed things. Fertility was always seen as the blessing of God. So if your land produces crops, that is a blessing of God. And if your animals bear offspring, that is a blessing of God. And if you have children, it is always a blessing of God. But conversely, the opposite is exactly true. If your land produces no crops, it was seen as a curse of God. If your animals produce no offspring, it's seen as a curse of God. And if you bear no children, it is seen as a curse of God. Hannah had no children. If a woman had any power, and let me just tell you this, she had none. But if a woman was to have any power in that culture, in the Old Testament, the only power that she might potentially have is through childbearing. Now, here's what we know. Because Hannah's name was mentioned first, we believe this. We believe that Elkanah loved Hannah. And listen to me, if you're like me, I know this, that when I get to heaven, the first place I'm going is the information booth, because I got questions, right? And I don't understand why God allowed polygamy. I don't understand that. I do believe that part of it was procreation, that Hannah could not have children. And so while it wasn't God's design, somehow God allowed it. And so he took another wife. But that other wife now has become a rival. And listen to me, some of you know this pain very clearly. You've tried to have children and have not been able to have children. Now imagine this. Your rival comes to you year after year after year and provokes you and makes fun of you and talks trash because you can't have children. There's got to be some part of Hannah that says, God, do you even care? Do you know what's going on here? Do you understand the pain that I'm in? Do you understand the suffering? I'm being provoked by my rival. God, do you care? And so the question is this, what does Hannah do? Because I think we'll see a valuable lesson in what Hannah does that tells us what we're to do. And there are two things that Hannah does that I want us to talk about. Verse 9 says this. Once when now they're going to the temple, they're going to Shiloh, they're going to worship. Every year they go to Shiloh, to the temple, to make sacrifice. And it says, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Hannah stood up. And I'm telling you that when we're in those situations where it's just pain and we say, God, can you even hear me? The first thing we got to do is we got to stand up. And stand up simply means this. We got to change our posture. Because when you're in so much pain, you're this. And all you see is your situation. All I see is my situation. I see me, I see myself, I see my circumstances, I see my pain. And Hannah stood up, and we got to stand up. We have got to stand up and get our eyes off our circumstances, right? She stood up. I want you to see this from the writer of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews says this, therefore, since we, followers of Jesus, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, talking about all the saints from the church and the prophets, it said this, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked before us. Everybody say this part with me. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. Stand up. Like we just got to get our eyes off our circumstances. I know it's hard. I was 16 years old. I'll never forget this. I'm 16 years old. You ever walk into your house and you know something's up? Something was not right, and I don't know how I knew that. And I walk up the driveway, and I just know something's not right. And in our house, you come up the driveway, and there's this little door off the side of the house. And I walked in there, and you walk right into the kitchen. And I'm in the kitchen, and I look at the walls, and something's up. And where there had been pictures and wall hangings, they're gone. Like they're just off the wall. They're gone. And I walk through the kitchen, and I kind of walk into the living room, and now it's obvious. Furniture, gone. Pictures, gone. Knickknacks, gone. Tchotchkes, gone. It's gone. And my father's standing in the living room. I said, Pop, where's everybody at? I have an older brother and an older sister. And he said, well, your sister is here, and your brother's here. And I said, where's Mom? He says, buddy, she's gone. I said, what do you mean she's gone? And he says, partner, she's not coming back. And I said, God, do you even care? Because I remember being a little kid when my older sister had come to me and she said, hey, things between our mom and our dad aren't good. And when you're a little kid, you just have no clue. And I said, what do you mean they're not good? And she said, they're not getting along. And I didn't really know how to process. She said, they're not getting along. And so I began to pray as a small kid, God, help my mom and dad get along. God, restore their marriage. God, smooth things out. God, clean up their differences. God, give them a love for each other. You know what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. And I prayed, and I prayed, and I asked my friends to pray, and I asked my pastor to pray. And you know what happened? Nothing. And I came home one day, and everything on our walls is gone, and I raised my fist to heaven, and I said, God, do you even care? Right? Because the natural tendency is, man, when circumstances are tough, we do this. We have this posture, and all we see is our circumstances. Hannah stood up. You know what we need to do? Somebody say it. You got to stand up. Right? But here's the second thing that she did, and I want to read this. It says, do not, she had gone to the temple, and she was silent, and she was praying, and she was in prayer, and the priest, Eli, actually thought she was drunk because she's just mouthing words. And she says this, she says, don't take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been what? Praying here out of my great anguish and misery. She's been praying. And so number one, we stand up, and number two, here's what we do. We look up. We look up, and we begin to look to God, and we begin to pray, and you know what we do? We worship. We worship. I want to show you this verse. Now, we know this, right? We know that it's difficult. I get that. But I want you to see that passage again from Hebrews. Put that up again. It says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, he continues, and he says this, Jesus, focus on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured what? The cross. He endured scorning. He endured its shame. He's saying here, when you fix your eyes on Jesus, when you stand up, when you get your focus on him, when you think about him and about worshiping him, you can endure anything. Jesus endured the cross. I'm telling you this. You can endure sickness. You're going to endure relationship issues. You can endure financial hardship. You can do this, fixing our eyes on Jesus. We stand up and we look up. Now listen to me. This is important. You say to me, but Neil, I don't feel like it. And I get that. But I want you to see this from Hannah. Listen to her. She's in pain. And it says, in her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord. In verse 15, it says, not so, my Lord, Hannah replied, I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. In verse 16, it says, do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying out here out of my great anguish and grief. Do you think Hannah felt like it? She didn't feel like it. But you know what she did? She stood up and she looked up. She got her eyes off her own situation, and she fixed her eyes on Jesus. I get it. You don't feel like it. I understand that. 20 years after my mom left, I was married. And one day I come home, and my house is empty, and my furniture's gone, and everything on my walls is gone. And my wife at the time had met a guy at the gym, and she was gone. And I said, God, do you even care? And I had to stand up and I had to look up, even when I didn't feel like it. You're not going to feel like it. That's what faith is. It's a decision to stand up and look up in spite of your circumstances. Right? Now, let me tell you part of why you don't feel like it. Because it's the strategy of the enemy. That's why we don't feel like it at that time, right? The enemy has schemes, the Bible says, tricks that he plays on our mind, and so we don't feel like. When I was a kid growing up, Sunday nights, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Did you watch that? And you watch Wild Kingdom, and there's an antelope standing in the field, and they're just minding their own business, because that's what antelope do. They mind their own business. And all of a sudden, the antelope goes like this. And they start looking around. And the camera pans, and it shows in the distance, and this is the lion sneaking up, because this is me being sneaky. They sneak up. And pretty soon, you know what the antelopes start to do? They start to run. And here's what happens when the antelope run. It thins out the herd, and pretty soon a couple of them get isolated off the back. Now, you know who gets isolated? The hurting and the wounded. The hurting and the wounded get isolated. And when they get isolated, that's when the lion pounces. Now, watch this from a different part of the book of Hebrews, where it says, from 1 Peter. 1 Peter says this. Be alert. Wake up, antelope. Be sober-minded. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around how? Like a roaring lion, looking for what? For someone to devour. You know why you don't feel like looking up? You know why you don't feel like that? Because it's a scheme of the enemy. Because the enemy can get you isolated. Some of you are here this morning and you're at church and you didn't feel like it because right now your life stinks. And you didn't feel like it and you came to church anything, and it's the right thing to do. Because your life is tough right now. Because you got circumstances right now. Because everything's not rosy right now. The enemy wanted you to stay home and you came to church anyway. You know what? There are other people who didn't come this morning. And you know why they didn't come? Because the enemy is trying to isolate them so that he can pounce on them. In Matthew, he says this, don't forsake the assembling together. Don't forsake that. Don't stop meeting together, but instead do this. Encourage one another. Now, here's what you don't realize. The moment that you walked into church today, you instantly have a ministry. You have a ministry, and you didn't even know it. Because let me ask you this. If you were discouraged and you came to church today, and you would have been the only one who came to church today, how encouraged are you? I don't know. But somebody's sitting on the other side of the room and you're encouraged. You might be the person sitting on the other side of the room and you didn't even know you have a ministry today. But you encourage other people just because you're here. They see you here and they realize somebody else is worshiping the same God that I'm worshiping today. And they hear you sing and they hear you look up. You fix your eyes on Jesus and it encourages them. It encourages them. The enemy wants to isolate you. When you feel like that, you got to lean in. You got to press in. You got to worship. You got to come to church and let the church encourage you. When we're like that, man, we stand up. We look up. We fix our eyes on Jesus. Now, here's the thing. I always like to leave everybody with what I call the big so what, which means this. If you slept through the whole thing so far, don't worry, you didn't miss it yet. But here's what I want you to walk out of here this morning. Here's your big so what. God's capacity to care is beyond our capacity to understand. I want to say it again. God's capacity to care is beyond our capacity to understand. Now, I want to read you this and see if you can make sense of this. Verse 20 says this. It says, you ever write in your Bible and then you can't read around your writing? It says, so in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel. Now, let me just tell you this, just so we all are aware of this. It doesn't mean every time you have a situation and things are tough and you pray, it doesn't mean that you always get what you want. It's just not life. It's not God's plan. In this particular story, she got a son and she named him Samuel. Now, Samuel can mean two things. It can mean to ask for, or it can mean God has heard. Now I want to show you this. Samuel grows up to become the great prophet of his day. He becomes the prophet who anoints King David, the greatest king that Israel will ever know. And furthermore, from David, 14 generations later came the Messiah. Now think about this. Do you think that Hannah had any clue? She had no clue that her son would anoint the king, that 14 generations later from his line would come the Messiah. You know why? Because God's capacity to care is beyond our capacity to understand. There's no possible way she could understand that. She couldn't begin to fathom how much God cared. Right. And it's the same for you and I. You wonder, does God care? And I ask the question, God, do you even care? And I would say this, God cares more than I could ever know. The greatest Bible verse that's known by more people than any other verse, John 3:16. For God so loved. In other words, because God cared so much, because God has the ability to care beyond our ability to understand. For God so loved the world so much that he gave his only son. Hey, when our circumstances aren't going great, when everything isn't peachy, when things are tough, when you're in a pinch, when your finances are difficult, when relationships are tough, when your health is not good, God's ability to care is beyond your ability to understand. Amen? Pray with me. Father, God, this morning, we give you praise, and we give you honor, and we give you glory. And God, we do that in spite of our circumstances. We still say you're good. And when things are tough, God, you are good. Good is not something you do, it's who you are. And so, God, we give you praise this morning. And God, I know this, that there are people sitting here this morning who are in a pinch, and their life is tough. But here's what we know, God, you care. Hey, if you're sitting here